Good afternoon, everybody. This is Congressman Mike Levin. Thank you so much for joining us for another virtual town hall. And I'm so grateful that you're here, whether you're on Twitter or Facebook, YouTube, or in any other manner. We're very, very happy to share some time with you this afternoon to talk about recent developments in our country, certainly COVID-19 and so much else happening. I'm actually coming to you this afternoon from Washington, D.C., where I've been since Tuesday for a variety of reasons, working on a number of pieces of legislation. More on that in just a second. I want to first give my wonderful wife a shout out for our 9th wedding anniversary, which was on Thursday. I was very sorry that I could not be there with you in person, but I love you and miss you already. It was also just our son's 8th birthday, so really, really proud of him. And want to also give a shout out to my parents. Obviously, it was just Father's Day. So my dad and my in-laws in Tucson, Arizona, my father-in-law, I'm very grateful for all your love and support as well. This is our, if you can believe it, 28th virtual town hall that we've done since the middle of March. And I'm so grateful to our whole team, certainly Jeremy, who does a great job putting these together, and everybody like Ellen Montanari and our whole staff, who just do an amazing job. I'm grateful for all of you. As Abraham Lincoln once said, I'm a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended on to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts. So that's our great point in doing these, to bring you, our constituents, the real facts. And we're very, very happy you're here. And I miss doing the in-person town halls. We had done, I think, 14 or 15 of those up until March of this year. And then we switched over to these virtual town halls. I look forward as soon as we can, as soon as it's safe, getting back to seeing you in person. It's been a very difficult time for our country, a time of great sacrifice, great loss, and over 125,000 deaths now from COVID-19. Truly an awful, awful statistic. We'll get to COVID-19 in just a second, but before that, I wanted to share more about recent legislation this week. Of course, we recently passed in the House of Representatives the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. And like so many millions of Americans across the country demanding accountability and comprehensive reform to a system that has allowed brutality and injustice against people of color for generations, I am very proud of the work of the House of Representatives this past week in passing this comprehensive bill. And I've had very productive conversations with both civil rights leaders and our local law enforcement officers, many of whom want to be part of the solution. And I know that working together, we can get great things done. So a few things about the Justice and Policing Act and what it actually does. It prohibits racial profiling, mandates training on racial profiling, bans chokeholds, carotid holds, and no-knock warrants, limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to law enforcement, mandates the use of dashboard cameras, body cameras, establishes a national police misconduct registry so that an officer cannot go from one jurisdiction to another if they don't meet certain background checks, amends federal criminal statute from a willfulness standard to a recklessness standard, reforms qualified immunity so that individuals are not barred from recovering damages when their constitutional rights are violated, establishes public safety innovation grants for community-based organizations to create local commissions and task forces to help communities to reimagine and develop concrete, just, and equitable public safety approaches, creates law enforcement and development training programs that mirror a lot of the recommendation from President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, requires state and local law enforcement agencies to report use of force data disaggregated by race and other factors, improves the use of pattern and practice investigations at the federal level, and creates a program for state attorneys general to develop authority to conduct independent investigations into problematic police departments. And in speaking this past week with General Javier Becerra, Attorney General of California, that was certainly of interest to him. Finally, it establishes a task force to coordinate the investigation, prosecution, and enforcement efforts of federal, state, and local governments in cases related to law enforcement misconduct. It's a bold package. I'm very proud that it's passed the House. Also last week, I co-sponsored Representative Sheila Jackson Lee's bill to make Juneteenth a national holiday, which I think is long overdue. And I also co-sponsored the Confederate Monument Removal Act, which was introduced by my dear friend Barbara Lee of Oakland, which would remove all statues of people who voluntarily served in the Confederate States of America from the National Statuary Hall collection in the Capitol. My great hope is that we use this opportunity to whatever extent we can to create a new normal that we can all be proud of in the United States. We have tremendous momentum right now. We've got to make sure that we meet this moment with the bold actions, both in Congress and also throughout the country. Now on to COVID-19. As I mentioned, very sadly, our country's lost over 125,000 lives from coronavirus. We've now reached just about 2.5 million cases nationwide. California has confirmed almost 207,000 cases. We're now the second highest state in terms of number of cases. We're approaching 6,000 deaths. San Diego County, 12,401 cases and 358 deaths. Orange County, 11,960 cases and 323 deaths. Over the past 2 weeks, Orange County has actually recorded more cases and more deaths, 3,524 new cases, 104 new deaths. San Diego County, 2,963 cases and 44 deaths. That's despite the fact that San Diego County has been consistently testing significantly more people than Orange County, and that continues to be a great concern of mine. Last month, I led an effort requesting more information from the OC Healthcare Authority regarding the county's low testing rates. We were briefed along with the entire OC delegation. They wrote us back with written answers, which responded to our inquiries, but it's clear to me that our constituents are still having a tough time and still facing barriers to testing. In fact, a number of our offices recently worked on a survey of our constituents, specifically in Orange County, and we found that of those who wanted a test, 62.2% had not gotten one because they were denied or did not know how. That is clearly unacceptable. So yesterday, I led another letter to the OC Healthcare Agency for more information regarding how we can change things for the better. Among other things, the letter states, and I quote, "Fast, accessible, and widespread testing is critical to protecting public health and preventing a resurgence as we continue to reopen. Ensuring accessible testing will not only reassure the public on behalf of businesses seeking to reopen, but will also support the contact tracing needed to control future outbreaks. We urge all parties to acknowledge this gap in testing and work to increase testing utilization and improve communication with the public. We appreciate the county's recent efforts to use funding provided by the federal government through the bipartisan CARES Act to launch a community outreach and advertising initiative to increase awareness of free COVID-19 testing options. But we believe that additional steps are necessary to ensure that all residents can conveniently access no-cost testing in Orange County. It's clear to me more now than ever that we cannot be complacent about COVID-19. We've got to follow the precautions. We've got to exercise good judgment. We've got to take care of one another. We've got to wear masks. We've got to socially distance. We've got to make sure that we're following all those steps that are recommended by the CDC and by the state of California Department of Public Health and by our counties as well. And look, as I mentioned time and again, we can't have a healthy economy unless we have healthy people. And the only way we're going to truly get back on track is if we look out for one another and we try as best we can to follow those guidelines. So what have we done in Congress? We mention it every week that we do these town halls. We passed a number of bipartisan bills to deal with COVID-19 all the way back in March, $8 billion for the vaccine, middle of March, $200 billion for emergency sick leave and nutrition assistance and a variety of other things. End of March, the CARES Act, over $2 trillion, both for public health and for the economic crisis that our country is facing. And then at the middle of April, more money for testing, more money for hospitals, and more money for small businesses. We then about a month ago, a little over a month ago, passed the HEROES Act in the House. And the HEROES Act was another $3 trillion. But it was an incredibly important bill. $875 billion for state and local governments, including smaller cities, such as we've got in the 49th district. And that's why all of the mayors, Republican mayors, Democratic mayors, all supported the assistance to the smaller cities. And they wrote a letter that we sent to leadership, and we got that in the bill. $300 million would come to our district, and they could use it for revenue recovery in addition to direct COVID-related expenses. There's plenty of other things in that bill as well. More money for testing and tracing, more money for our hospitals, expanded unemployment insurance that lasts longer. The expanded unemployment insurance is going to end at the end of July. The Paycheck Protection Program, the applications end just next week will be the end of when you can apply for a PPP loan. It's clear to me that the virus has not subsided the way that we had hoped. Unfortunately, many states are experiencing a record number of cases, hospitalization rates higher than we would like. We see the stories every day, and Dr. Garfein can speak to them in a moment. And we cannot stop the assistance that we're providing the American people to prevent the loss of lives and the loss of livelihoods. We cannot take our foot off the gas right now, and we cannot declare mission accomplished. Far from it. We've got to continue to help protect the lives and livelihoods of the American people. And in addition to that, we should be doing more for hazard pay for frontline workers, more to save the U.S. Postal Service. I led a letter of 137 of my colleagues to try to provide a $25 billion lifeline to save the USPS. And look, I don't expect Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate to agree with every word of every page of our bill. It was an 1,800-page bill. But I do expect them to take action. I do expect them to work with us, to come up with their own proposals and recognize this moment and recognize the need to continue to help the American people. Again, 125,000 Americans tragically dead, and COVID-19 rates going up in many states throughout the country, particularly in the West and the South. It's clear to me that we must continue our assistance. I'm also very troubled by the most recent efforts of the Trump administration to dismantle and destroy the Affordable Care Act. The new brief that the Trump administration filed with the Supreme Court on Thursday left zero doubt that this administration wants the entire ACA to be torn out, root and branch, including its protections for pre-existing conditions. And if the president and the Republicans in Congress have their way and the ACA were to be eliminated, 47,000 people in our district alone, think of that statistic, 47,000 people in our district alone would lose their health insurance. Simply unacceptable, particularly during a public health crisis of this magnitude. It would force even more people into financial ruin, could potentially cause more people to lose their lives because of the lack of health insurance. We can't allow it to happen. In fact, we ought to be doing the opposite. We ought to be protecting and strengthening the Affordable Care Act, and we have a bill in Congress that we're going to be passing very soon, which would do just that. So let me be clear. In this time of crisis, Mitch McConnell is refusing any more funding for critical public services devastated by this economic crisis, and he's basically told every teacher, every nurse, every firefighter in California and throughout the United States to drop dead. And that is simply unacceptable. They want to stop economic assistance to the unemployed who lost their jobs during this pandemic. Well, the president says the crisis is over. It's incomprehensible. The two areas where we need leadership in this troubled time, protecting lives, protecting livelihoods. I believe that this president and McConnell are failing us, endangering us, and making things immeasurably worse. And that's difficult, but that's the reality of the situation. So, with that out of the way, I have more positive news, which is very welcome these days. Local environmental issues, as many of you know, have been at the top of my list throughout my tenure, my term in Congress. And on Wednesday, I was very proud that our San Onofre Task Force released this comprehensive report. It's about 80 pages long. You can see it online. Lots have been written about it in the Union Tribune, the Orange County Register, and elsewhere. I'm very proud of the work of the San Onofre Task Force. When I was sworn in to Congress in 2019, one of the first things I did was create a task force to drive solutions to try to get that waste off our coast as quickly and as safely as possible. I didn't just want another do-nothing political task force. I wanted a dedicated group of local experts and community stakeholders truly passionate about the challenges we face and creating solutions. So I appointed the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Ray Diosco, and former Navy Rear Admiral and former Navy Mayor of San Diego, Len Herring, to co-chair the group. They reviewed the technical, legal, and regulatory status of spent fuel storage at San Onofre. They made 30 recommendations on policy, and it's really a roadmap for how we can move forward together. One step that we've already taken was the introduction of the Spent Fuel Prioritization Act. That legislation says that of all those sites across the country that have nuclear waste, of which there's about 130, move the waste first from those sites that have the highest seismic risk and the highest population density. And unfortunately, we finished first. We have 9 million people. Within 50 miles, we've got active earthquake faults. And we're not even talking about sea level rise, although that's a concern of mine as well, because that waste is only 100 feet from the Pacific Ocean. The task force's report continues to underscore the importance to aggressively pursue federal legislation that directs not only spent fuel prioritization, but also that the DOE create, along with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, new safety standards, new protocols, and we also got to explore the creation of a new nuclear waste administration that can solely be responsible for the nation's nuclear waste stockpile. Long overdue, and it needs to happen. No matter where spent nuclear fuel is located, we have to make sure that it is stored safely, and that's where our task force has recommended that we have new federal legislation that mandate that canisters for spent nuclear fuel have a minimum design life of at least 100 years. The failure of a canister storing spent nuclear fuel could be catastrophic, which is another reason why we need to strengthen inspections by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And there's a lot more recommendations. We're looking for new and innovative solutions. There's a call for research and development, a thorough review of international practices related to spent fuel storage, collaboration of best practices between civilian and military spent nuclear fuel storage, detailed quality and training programs for all personnel that are working on spent nuclear fuel storage as an element of licensing, plenty more. And I plan to create a congressional spent nuclear fuel caucus of additional members who are interested in this issue so we can make real progress with solid bipartisan cooperation. I think the time to wait for others to solve this problem is gone. We've got to take every initiative possible to get that waste off the coast as quickly and as safely as we can, and that's exactly what I am doing and will continue to do for as long as I serve. Another local issue, I hope you all got a chance to see the recent 60 Minutes story on pollution in the Tijuana River Valley. It aired, I think, 3 weeks ago, and you should check it out. I'm sure you can see it online if you couldn't see it when it aired. There's a huge problem at the border with regard to water pollution, and I'm very honored that we were able to get $300 million in the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement to deal with that pollution. Now we've got to make sure that those wastewater infrastructure projects are done in the best possible fashion. Our team is working very closely with others on that, and I'm truly grateful for my colleagues in the San Diego congressional delegation and for Kevin Faulconer, the mayor of San Diego, for working together on a bipartisan basis to make it happen. Of course, wouldn't be possible without the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, who really pushed for that as well. Finally, I was pleased to announce the Department of Transportation awarded Sandag $11.5 million along with the North County Transit District to protect the Del Mar Bluffs. Many of you know we've got one of the most important rail corridors in the United States in our district, Los Angeles-San Diego Rail Corridor, both in terms of passengers, cargo, and the strategic importance because it connects two bases, Miramar and Camp Pendleton. It is critically important that we protect that rail corridor. This money will help do that. $11.5 million, just the beginning. We're going to need far more. But the money will go to subsurface drainage, concrete channels, storm drains, and support piles. And that's in addition to a lot of the other funds that we've gotten for Encinitas, Solana Beach, San Clemente, for planning, engineering, and design of additional coastal protection projects. I'm really, really pleased that all that funding has come in. I mentioned last week, I'll follow up, new assistance for our veterans, 2 bills, the Homeless Veteran Coronavirus Response Act, as well as a new program for rapid retraining for our veterans to get them back into the workforce. Truly awful that our veteran unemployment rate, which we had all the way down to 3.5, actually lower, 3.1%, is now probably 4 or 5 times that number. Our program would create a 12-month rapid retraining for veterans to be able to get jobs in industries in demand. And I'm really excited about that. And our homelessness bill, both are bipartisan, bicameral, and I think both have a very good chance of becoming law soon. Speaking of veteran and military issues, I also was deeply troubled by a New York Times report, which came out late last night, that says that the president and others allowed Russia to place a bounty on our soldiers fighting in Afghanistan and basically did nothing to intervene. They learned of it, according to the reporting, back in March, did nothing in March, nothing in April, and then in May, in fact, President Trump wanted to admit Russia into the G7. Really an alarming and unacceptable report. And obviously, Congress, I believe, needs to thoroughly investigate, determine the validity of that reporting, and we need to hold people accountable, as this is entirely unacceptable. The allegations in this article are very, very problematic, to say the very least. Finally, one thing that I try to do during all our town halls is share the number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, because I've been saddened to hear stories of increased domestic violence during COVID-19. I encourage anyone in need of help to call or text the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That number again, 1-800-799-SAFE. With that, I'm pleased to welcome our excellent guests, Dr. Richard Garfein and Dante Brooks. First, I'm honored to once again be joined by one of our great local experts, Dr. Richard Garfein. And Richard, I looked this up. This is your 12th virtual town hall. Of the 28 that we've done, you have been on 12 of them. That's amazing. We're so grateful for you. You have provided such an invaluable resource, your background, your knowledge, sharing it with our constituents, getting them the facts. Can't thank you enough. You're amazing.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So, Dr. Garfein, for those that don't know, he is an infectious disease epidemiologist, educator, and healthcare innovator who seeks to understand the causes of disease and translate that understanding into impactful solutions. He earned his PhD at Johns Hopkins University, his Master's of Public Health at San Diego State University, served as Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer and epidemiologist for 7 years at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, before joining the UC San Diego School of Medicine in 2005. His research focuses primarily on airborne and bloodborne infections, often associated with health disparities and substance use, including tuberculosis, HIV, and viral hepatitis in the U.S. and abroad. His research on digital adherence technology over the last decade informed CDC and WHO guidelines on the use of telehealth for remotely monitoring patients with tuberculosis. And of course, such research has great relevance for COVID-19 today. Amazing. 12 town halls, doctor. It's incredible. Next, I'd like to introduce Dante Brooks. Thank you for being with us, Dante. Dante was raised by 2 Marines. He attended Oceanside High School. He went to Palomar College for undergrad and then to Cal State San Marcos for business. That is about as local gets. That's incredible. And in addition to starting up several businesses, he launched the Made You Smile movement, which teaches students how to take ownership of the ability to make themselves happy. Dante has visited dozens of local schools in the 49th district, and I'm honored and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. And Dante, I'd like to begin with you for your opening comments. Take it away.
First of all, Mike, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to your platform and giving me the opportunity to kind of voice my opinion on how we can bridge the gap between the younger generation and the older generation to create positive change in our communities. The last thing we want to see right now is all the hard work, energy, and passion that have been put forth the last couple of weeks to slow down. We want to keep that momentum going and see how we can all work together to create lasting change in our communities. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we have a ton of questions. We're going to get to as many of them as possible. As always, you can email townhallquestions@mikelevin.org if you have a question or a comment. We'll get to as many today, and if we don't get them through all of them today, we'll get to them next week. Actually, not next week. Next week is the 4th of July weekend. We'll get them the following week. Dante, I wanted to open with a few questions that we have for you. First is, what ways can the 18 to 25-year-old demographic get involved in their local governments other than protests and other than voting?
I think there are several ways, several very effective ways to get that group involved. The first one would be just simply reaching out. Our councilmen and our community leaders are accessible. You can take a meeting with these people. I remember taking a meeting with a gentleman named Jack Feller, who was at the time, he was a council member of Oceanside. And I took that meeting simply because I wanted to get to know who he was. And at the same time, I wanted him to get to know who I was and what I was doing for his community. Him being a tool for the community and me being a tool for the community, and the fact that we didn't know each other, I felt that there was a little bit of a lapse there. And who better to network with than one of the leaders in our community? I'm a strong believer in that iron sharpens iron. So with him being able to educate me, I'm then able to leave that meeting, go to my peers, educate them, and before you know it, one meeting has turned into educating 100 people on a topic that I didn't know about before. I'm also a firm believer that we're all put here with the same opportunity to positively impact as many people as we possibly can. And with that being said, there's the simplest tool for 18 to 25 demographic is just reaching out, set a meeting with these town leaders. The difference between a leader and somebody who isn't a leader is the leader took the steps to become a leader. They put themselves out there. So if we are, as a whole, scared to put ourselves out there, then we're going to lose the opportunity to become leaders. So that's a very simple way that the 18 to 25 demographic can get involved. Other than the protests, there's a lot of passion behind those protests, but at the end of the day, where's the call to action? Everybody says, go vote. But what are we voting on? Who's educating you on what to vote on? Are you getting a one-sided opinion? So again, I think it's very important just to set a meeting and meet these leaders in your community.
Thank you for that, Dante. Another question for you. How can our listeners help the younger generation in getting involved in their local government? Can they really?
This is a good, absolutely. They absolutely can. Perfect example. Access to your network. And I mean network of people, network of friends. I wouldn't be talking to you if my mother, who is an employee of Santa Onofre, didn't introduce me to a wonderful gentleman named Rob Howard, who ended up, he's currently running for mayor of Oceanside. She told me to reach out to him just because he was a very involved member of the community and she knows my work in the community. So I reached out to him via Instagram, gave him my number, asked him to give me a call, and he called me. This is someone who's running for a position of leadership in Oceanside who called me from a direct message on Instagram. We've had several great conversations. And from that, he was able to give me the opportunity to be talking to you right now. So perfect example of just allowing access to your network. Letting the young generation know that, hey, I know a person that you can talk to. Would you like to talk to them? Absolutely. Put yourself out there and put yourself in front of that person. And who knows what could happen. Now I'm talking to Congressman Mike Levin on his town hall.
Well, and what's interesting, first of all, Rob is a great guy. He's also on our San Onofre task force. He knows a ton about that plant, having worked in it. The other thing is when people direct message me, I actually do forward every single one to my team, and we try to follow up with every single one. So hopefully we can keep up. I used to try to get back to people immediately. I still try to get back, though, to every single person that reaches out. Hopefully we do that. Finally, what do you think is the biggest obstacle for the 18 to 25-year-old demographic when it comes to taking political action?
I would say the biggest obstacle, and this is from my experience in talking to the younger generation, because a lot of when I started, those students that I started talking with are now in the 18 to 25 demographic. And from back then, getting all that data from them, the biggest thing is, I would say, personal fear of failure, fear of being rejected, fear of not being heard, and the fear of failure. The fear of failure can take over any person, and it's going to cause them to hesitate. It's going to cause them not to want to reach out to the people they should be reaching out to over fear of rejection. And I believe that stems from social media and the ability to project the perfect life without mistakes. So fear of failure comes from a fear of making mistakes. So I think that's going to be the biggest problem, because I wouldn't be here today if I didn't step out on the platform and want to spread the message. I was scared to at first, but I literally was thrown onto a stage and I was able to talk to an entire school. And from that, it kind of evolved into being able to have my own movement, get invited to other schools, sharing stages with great people like Stedman Graham, Bobby DePorter, things like that. But yeah, I would say the biggest obstacle is going to be personal fear of failure. So it's important for the older generation to allow the younger generation to know that it's okay to fail. It's okay to fail forward. It's okay to try new things. It's okay to reach out to people that you thought might not want to talk to you. Because again, that's going to help the older generation and give them more data on how to clearly communicate to the younger generation. So just eliminate that fear and step out there on that platform and let yourself be heard, and don't be afraid of rejection.
Extremely good advice. If somebody wants to join that movement and follow you on social media, how do they do it?
My Instagram handle is @TiddaTidda. It's @TIDDA_TIDDA. And you guys can DM me anytime you want. I will answer. You can DM my business account. It's We Defy Lasers. And yeah, I'm more than open to talk to anybody about anything.
Cool. I am @Mike Levin on Instagram, and I'm slower to respond to direct messages, but I will try. Excellent. Before I go any further, I also have to say one other thing, which I've heard very poor job on my part at the beginning. My mother-in-law's birthday is today. So I wanted to wish my mother-in-law, Judy Parker, I love you very much, watching in Tucson, I think, if she hasn't already turned off, because I didn't wish her a happy birthday at the beginning. But I hope you're doing well. Tucson's been going through a real rough time lately with wildfires, with all sorts of things, spike of COVID in Arizona, and some police issues there, and just wish everyone all the best in Tucson, where my wife is from. I wanted to turn to additional questions. We've got a bunch. Stephanie and Dana Point asks, what is your position on defunding the police department? And could you explain the differences between the House and Senate bills on reforming the police and law enforcement? Well, Stephanie, thank you very much for that question. I do not support defunding the police, but I do definitely support investing more in social services, diversity of police departments, and community policing. And I support the Justice in Policing Act, which we just passed in the House, named after George Floyd. And it will make real reforms. As I mentioned at the top, all the measures in that bill, overall, it will, I think, meet the moment that we're facing. I think the Senate bill, frankly, does not. You know, the Senate bill provides a lot of incentives, but doesn't actually get to the root problems that we're facing. And I think the only way we're going to have real healing is if we have real reform. So as examples, it doesn't ban chokeholds. It doesn't ban no-knock warrants. It just falls short. And it's not the time to encourage police departments not to choke people. It's the time to ban them from doing so, as an example. Dr. Garfein, here is a question for you, my friend, from Lori in San Clemente. Lori asks, I just read about a new treatment from Regeneron, an antibody cocktail that could be given as a treatment. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Regeneron is a company that produces 3 treatments that use antibodies. And antibodies could come from either plasma from people who have already had the infection and are recovered. And so we've talked before about convalescent plasma, where people donate their plasma and then you can purify out the antibodies to use as therapy, or they could be manufactured in a laboratory. And so Regeneron has a cocktail which includes 2 antibodies that are shown to be effective in inactivating the COVID virus in a laboratory. And just to give people a little bit of an understanding of how this kind of a therapy works, the antibodies are injected into a patient, and if the patient already has the virus in them, the antibodies will now be circulating in their blood, and hopefully the intent is for those antibodies to inactivate the virus and prevent the person from getting sicker and having a more severe disease. It could also be used for somebody who may have been exposed to the virus or is going to be in a situation where they are very likely to be exposed. And if that person has antibodies circulating in their blood, it'll keep the virus from causing an infection. So it could be used as prevention, but it could also be used as treatment. So very promising, very exciting. Regeneron isn't the only company that has been working on this, but they are working on a drug that's going into clinical trials. And the trial that they actually just started involves 4 separate groups. So there's people who are hospitalized with COVID-19. There's people who have symptoms of the disease but are not hospitalized. So these are infected individuals. And then there's healthy people who are at high risk for getting sick. So the older folks or people that have underlying health conditions. And the 4th group are people who are in close contact with people who are sick. So there's 2 groups that are sick and 2 groups that are at risk of getting sick. And so they're evaluating this new drug both for prevention and for treatment. So it's going to take a little bit of time for that trial to run its course and to find out if it works. The good news is that these types of therapies have been used for other diseases in the past. So there's a good precedent for using this type of therapy. And the company also has a therapy that's about to be, it's being reviewed by the FDA right now as a treatment for Ebola. So there's some precedent there as well. The main thing to just keep in mind, though, with a drug like this is that those antibodies don't last forever. The host is not making antibodies on their own like they would with a vaccine. So it would have to be re-administered in order to maintain protection. But certainly it's a very, very good option for people that are currently sick or at high risk of becoming sick and don't have a vaccine available yet.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Lewis in Carlsbad asks, is there a plan to force the Senate into passing another COVID stimulus bill? I believe that our economy is going to take a long time to recover. Lewis, I agree. There was recently analysis done by the Fed, Chairman Powell, and they sent it to the Congress. It was around 70 or 80 pages long, and it was very daunting, suggesting $15 trillion hit to GDP, including 7 or 8 trillion this year. That document was later made publicly available, so you can find it online. But the bottom line is the pandemic is not taking a pause, and we cannot take a pause either. Unfortunately, that's what Mitch McConnell is doing right now. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, the unemployment expansion will end in July. Actually, the 25th of July for most people will be the functional ending of that expanded unemployment insurance. So I think the public sentiment needs to be clear and overwhelming. And it's the old Abraham Lincoln adage, public sentiment in politics. With it, you can do almost anything. Without it, virtually nothing. We passed the HEROES Act. I'm very proud of that work. We sent it to the Senate, and they've sat on it now for over a month. We just need to keep that pressure on. The other one who wants to see continued action is Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, who's acknowledged the need for additional stimulus, particularly given what we're seeing in many of the states where we've got now record case numbers and infections, hospitalizations, ICU capacity. All the numbers are not going the direction that would lead us to believe that this is going to be over at the end of July. So we have to just be very cognizant of the facts on the ground and meet the moment that we're in, not turn our backs on people who really do need our help. Here's a question for Dr. Garfein from Barbara in Oceanside. Why is there no transparency about exactly where these community outbreaks are happening? Wouldn't it be helpful to know which restaurants, resorts, etc.?
Yeah, Barbara raises a good question. I think we all would like to have more information so that we can know how to protect ourselves and our community. And I think that this is a question that it's hard to answer. San Diego County has a link on their website called the Triggers for Modifying Health Officer Orders that has a number of metrics listed that the county is going to use to decide when it's time to either relax the restrictions or add more restrictions. And one of those metrics is the number of new outbreaks that have occurred in the past 7 days. Currently, in the past 2 weeks, the county's announced that there's been 8 community outbreaks that have occurred over the past 7 days. And these outbreaks have actually occurred in campgrounds, a social club, a restaurant, private homes, and a federal facility. And an outbreak is considered 3 or more cases that have something in common, but they're not part of the same household. So maybe eating in a restaurant, maybe working in the same building, maybe going to a birthday party at somebody's house. So I think the question is not, should we be told about every one of these outbreaks and all the details about it? Because it's hard to know whether or not there's anything you can do about that. If it's an outbreak that occurs at somebody's birthday party, obviously you're not going to do anything about it. If it's an outbreak that's occurring in a restaurant or in a business, I think that's important. But I think it's important to understand that the county is investigating each one of those outbreaks. They're trying to find out, is it only 3 cases or is it bigger than that? And are there more steps that need to be taken? If the county identifies a workplace, they're going to not only talk to the cases, but they're going to look at the environment, and they're going to say, is this an environment that will perpetuate more of these kinds of outbreaks? Are they not wearing masks? Are they not social distancing? Are they, too crowded? Is the air conditioning, blowing in a direction that's going to stimulate some more transmission? And that's part of the investigation. Now, once that's done, telling people that there was an outbreak there doesn't necessarily change somebody's risk. I mean, the risk should hopefully be gone. So I think I understand there's the concern by people and they want to know where these outbreaks are occurring so that they know whether or not to patronize a business. But I think it's important to allow the county, the investigations to take place and for the proper response to be taking place. And I think the more important thing is that we need to know how to take steps to protect ourselves. So stay home if you don't have to go out and eat in a restaurant, order out or cook at home. Pay attention to the practices and the policies of those businesses that you want to patronize. Do they actually allow enough space for people to be far enough apart that they're not spreading their infection? Are people wearing masks in those businesses? Does it look like, it's a safe place for you to be? If it is, that's what we can do to protect ourselves, is be aware of what safe situations are and what aren't, and don't put ourselves in unsafe situations.
So easy, and yet it seems like people are having a hard time following some of these very basic rules. Next question from Sarah in Capistrano Beach. Is there any update on the hospital reopening in San Clemente? Thank you for taking my question. Well, Sarah, I have had discussions over the last year or so with a number of people, Memorial Care and others, about potentially reopening the facility in some way. I know that they have the pop-up testing center there now, which that's great. And I think there's no plans that I know of, any firm plans to do anything, but that's ultimately going to be up to the local stakeholders, and I try not to weigh in. Obviously, I'll support in whatever way I can with whatever direction they want to go. But I'm very grateful that Memorial Care is doing a lot of that testing, and I've met with them about that. Here's another question for you, Doctor, from Jim in San Clemente. Do you worry about the COVID rate in Tijuana spilling north into San Diego?
Well, I'll tell you this. I worry about people in Tijuana, and I worry about people in Mexico, because I think that that the situation is challenging there, and they have far fewer resources than we do. And I think that the people in Mexico deserve the same health care that we all have. In terms of the cases coming up from Mexico, I can just tell you right now that there's about 1.8 million people in Tijuana and about 3.3 million people in San Diego. Tijuana has about a fifth the number of cases that we do. Now, obviously, there's a difference in the amount of testing. They're not doing as much testing in Mexico, but that doesn't seem to be alone sufficient explanation for that difference. So I can tell you this, people in Tijuana and other Mexico border cities, including doctors, health officials, and ordinary citizens, are actually pretty worried about us bringing coronavirus to Mexico as much as we might be concerned about them bringing it back here. We are seeing that there's an increase in cases in southern San Diego. However, the health officials say that U.S. citizens who live in Mexico and come north legally through ports of entry in their cars or on foot have contributed to this rise in cases in U.S. hospitals along the southern border. So these are not necessarily people that are, sneaking under walls or coming into the country illegally. A lot of the cases that are ending up in our hospitals are actually U.S. citizens who are living in Mexico but come up here for treatment. So I think it's important that we do as much as we can to help our neighbors to the south to maintain or to manage the pandemic down there, because it's affecting us on both sides of the border. And I'd just like to sort of give a shout out to the faculty and staff at UCSD who have been going down to Tijuana to help out doctors, both in Tijuana and actually in Mexicali, by providing training and support for the physicians in those hospitals. And it's really having a big impact. The doctors there they're very capable, but they haven't had training in things like using ventilators, which are so crucial right now. And so being able to work with pulmonologists from the US and getting that kind of training is just making their health system stronger. And everything I've heard about that collaboration has just been going fantastically. So I think that's the kind of thing we want to continue to encourage.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think it's on everyone's mind right now, doctors. We see particularly the Imperial Beach, or not Imperial Beach, but Imperial County situation that is very concerning. We see the impact that it's had on hospitals throughout, certainly the southern part of San Diego County, but it also has impacted some of our hospitals in North County. Tri-City the other day was on the phone with them or on a Zoom with them, and they mentioned that. So hopefully we can work with them. Here's a question from Jill in Del Mar. Now that President Trump has house-cleaned Voice of America with his favorites who are not journalists and will only spread Trump's word, I'm concerned about the First Amendment and fair reporting. A Pulitzer Prize-winning CEO of Voice of America was fired, and on down the line. All board members were forced to resign. Can Congress cut funding to Voice of America until Biden is elected and puts the right people back? Well, I don't know if that would be wise to cut funding. We certainly could pass a bill to do that. Whether it would impact, we could do it in time to impact funding prior to a new administration, I'm uncertain of. We can look into it, but I wouldn't cut funding. But what I would say is that what's happened is incredibly troubling. And for those who are unfamiliar, the pick that Trump had to head the agency that oversees Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, he was waiting for 2 years for Senate confirmation. He finally got in there and cleaned house, and he wiped out all those journalists. Many of them quit. And that agency, Voice of America, is supposed to be independent. That's America's voice literally to the world. So it's deeply troubling. And I have been watching this, and like several other things that I mentioned today, we are quite concerned. And we're going to take whatever action we need to amplify and also to, if need be, take additional measures. But I appreciate your concern, Jill, and I share it. Here's a question for you, Dr. Garfein, from Carla. My family and I are trying to stay calm about the rising coronavirus numbers, but I don't see how we're going to bring the numbers back down with people going back to work. What are the chances that we have to shut down again? That's I'd call it the $1 million question, but it's probably the $1 trillion question.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Carla, many of us share your same concerns. The number of cases in California is rising. The latest statewide figures show that hospitalizations have increased by 32% over the past 14 days, and the intensive care unit hospitalizations are up by 19%. COVID patients are in 34% of the available ICU beds in the state. So, over a third of our ICU beds are filled up with coronavirus right now. And the thing that's concerning is that those ICU beds are not going to be available for people that are having heart attacks or other infections or car accidents or other conditions where they need those beds. The state's daily update issued on Friday reported that there were 4,890 new cases with 79 additional deaths in California. And the rate of positive tests is trending upward, going from an average of 5.3% over the last 14 days to 5.7% in the last 7 days. And as the congressman mentioned, Imperial Valley is another area of concern. Over the past 14 days, or the average, their COVID rate is approaching 23% compared to 5.7% statewide. So this is huge, and this is a big problem. And as the congressman mentioned, those cases, too many of them for Imperial County to handle. And so they're being referred to hospitals in San Diego and Riverside and potentially even Orange County, and to try to take on the excess cases. So the governor has actually warned Imperial County and said if things don't get better, he's going to have to take additional action, and that does mean shutting down businesses, closing down schools and the like. But he wants to give the county, not just Imperial but other counties that are having higher rates, the opportunity to take action and rectify the situation on their own. He understands that this isn't easy, and it takes time to take action. But there is we are at this point now where we're actually looking at these increases in cases and really having to make the hard decision about whether opening things back up was a good idea. And I think I'll just go back to what I keep saying is that we all play a part in this. And if we want to see those businesses stay open, we have to do our part to socially distance, wear our masks, use disinfectants, be respectful of other people and try to prevent transmission. That's how we're going to keep society going. If we think that we can just stop at what we're doing, we're going to see those cases rise and we're going to be in trouble.
Advice is so simple and yet so important. Hopefully people are listening. Victoria in Carlsbad has a very short question. Will you vote for DC statehood? Victoria, I did vote for DC statehood. We actually did that yesterday. And I think it's long past due. DC residents have been taxed and have been participating in virtually every other way in our country other than actually being a state. And they're not represented with a voting member of Congress. Their member, Eleanor Holmes Norton, does not get a floor vote. And what we did yesterday is we actually passed a bill that would create a state, Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, after Frederick Douglass. So I was very proud to do that, and I hope that in time the Senate will take it up. But I think the slogan on many of the license plates that you see here in DC, no taxation without representation, pretty much says, or it says representation without taxation. Pretty much says all you need to know and why we need DC statehood. And I think it's long overdue. Here's a question for Dr. Garfein from Roberto in Cardiff. Both my wife and I had COVID-19. We both tested positive, and we both have recovered. Thank God we did not have to go to the hospital. To confirm that it was okay to leave the house, we were tested again, and we both tested negative. Our doctor then asked us to go get the blood test for antibodies, which we did down in San Diego, and neither of us had any antibodies. How can this be?
It's magic. So yeah, this is challenging. Most people who are infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus produce antibodies within 1 to 3 weeks of becoming infected, and the quantity of the antibodies and how long those antibodies remain in the blood can vary from person to person. And that can be dependent on a lot of factors, such as the dose of exposure of the virus, whether or not they develop symptoms, and whether or not their immune system is intact. So this could have occurred naturally. You may have had the virus, you may have recovered from it, and at the time that you were tested for the antibodies, the antibody levels may have gone down to the point where they're not detectable at the test. This also brings up the issue of the tests themselves. There are over 100 antibody tests that are on the market, and only a few of them have actually received the emergency use authorization from the FDA. And the EAU is not the same thing as FDA approval. FDA approval is where the FDA has actually looked at the evidence provided by the manufacturers and is convinced that the test is actually reliable, accurate, and safe to use. So far, no antibody test has been approved by the FDA as being an FDA-approved test. So what we're working with is, sort of like flying the airplane or building the airplane as we are flying it, which is we're using tests that we think are pretty good, but at this point, we're still developing evidence. So it's possible that the test failed to detect antibodies, even if they're actually in your blood. You may want to get tested again and see how see if you get a different result. But the good news is that you've had the virus. Both you and your wife are healthy. You've recovered, and thank goodness for that. And whether or not you have antibodies at this point, I think it would be reassuring to know. But I think the most important thing is that you've recovered.
Absolutely. Patrick in San Clemente asks, millions of people have lost their jobs over the past few months. Is there a plan for Congress to invest in infrastructure projects? Good news. Yes, there is, Patrick. It's called the Moving Forward Act, and I think we're going to be passing it very, very soon. In fact, I think next week might be Infrastructure Week. Seems like every week has been Infrastructure Week, kind of in fits and starts throughout this administration. But next week we intend to pass a broad and comprehensive $1.5 trillion infrastructure package. And I thought I would just talk about some of it. It's H.R. 2 is the bill number, formerly called the Moving Forward Act. Rebuilds our highways, bridges, transit, rail, airports, ports, and harbors by investing nearly $500 billion in a variety of surface transportation projects, and also to put us on a path towards zero emissions from the transportation sector, all while protecting American jobs with strong Buy America provisions and labor protections. Invest in our children's future with a $130 billion investment in school infrastructure, so important, targeted for those schools that are not meeting health and safety standards. It also is going to create 2 million jobs. We need to create those jobs. And we're also investing billions in upgrading childcare facilities, and it modernizes our energy infrastructure, something that's so important to me for a clean energy future. More than $70 billion to transform our electric grid, promote new renewable energy infrastructure, and help develop an electric vehicle charging network. I'm excited about that. And support energy efficiency and climate resilience. Invest boldly in affordable housing by directing over $100 billion to reduce housing inequality. Expands affordable high-speed internet, so important to underserved communities, with a $100 billion investment in high-speed internet and broadband access. Upgrades hospitals and healthcare infrastructure by investing about $30 billion to do that. Ensures clean water across the United States by investing in water infrastructure to remove dangerous contaminants from our drinking water and to install new safe wastewater infrastructure. Delivers a 21st century postal service. Again, we can't forget about the importance of the U.S. Postal Service. Also helps pursue a zero emissions postal fleet. Promotes investments in our community by spurring private investment through the tax code, through a revitalized Build America Bonds program, expansions of private activity bonds, and significant enhancements to the new markets tax credit and the rehabilitation tax credit. All of that and more will be on the floor. I'm honored to be leading the way on several provisions in that bill, and looking forward to being able to share more information about the bill in the weeks and in the months ahead. But it all comes down to this. The other day, I had a chance to watch again the documentary on PBS, Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelts, talking about all the programs put in place by Franklin Roosevelt. And a lot of it had to do with public works. They were facing a massive economic crisis with the Great Depression. And we have a choice. Do we want to be the Franklin Roosevelt of our day, or do we want to be the Herbert Hoover of our day? I think it's pretty easy to say we want to be the Franklin Roosevelt. We want to get this economy working again, and we want to do it in a sustainable way. So this is a great, great bill to do just that. I'm very proud of it. Here's a question for Dr. Garfein from Deborah in Vista. I saw on TV that New York is going to quarantine travelers from a few states. Do you think California should do the same thing? And I think we're right on the cusp of them wanting to quarantine us, from what I saw.
Yeah. It's not just New York, it's New York and New Jersey, and I think Massachusetts.
Connecticut.
Yeah, Connecticut. Thank you. Yep. I think that isn't possible. We're a very big state. We've got, a lot of borders, and we've got a lot of roads coming in and out. And it also would be non-productive. So the epidemic is now what we call the disseminated stage, as opposed to it being an isolated epidemic. And what that means is that now it's everywhere. It's not like it's just in a little pocket that we can surround and hope that it'll go away. So I think it'd be folly to think that we can just stop the spread by closing up our borders when we already have so much transmission taking place within our state. So under the circumstances, I think the appropriate response is for everyone nationwide, not just in California, to get into the habit of taking the necessary precautions to prevent transmission, regardless of whether we're interacting with our neighbors or coworkers or individuals from outside of our community. And the thing that we are doing that is really effective is what we call contact tracing. And that's where health officials, as soon as they find out about a case, and that could be through a hospital or a healthcare provider or somebody going to a testing center, when they find out about a case and they find out who they've been in contact with, and they get a list of all those names, and then when they call up all those contacts, they inform those people that they may have been exposed, and they offer them testing, and they ask them to stay in their homes for 2 weeks, which is the incubation period for the infection. And if people actually do that and they abide by that, then those new cases, if they do occur, those people are going to be staying home. They're not going to be transmitting it to anybody else, knowingly or unknowingly. And this is a tried and true method. It works. It's being rolled out across the country. And the more effectively we do it, the faster we're going to stop the epidemic.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Here's a question from Sky in Dana Point. Is it possible to have trained specialists respond to certain 911 calls instead of the police? Well, Sky, I think it's possible, but just to reiterate, I don't want to defund or police at all. I think we want well-trained police officers to respond to 911 calls anytime there's a potentially dangerous emergency. But to your point, I think we should invest more in social services. I think we especially should invest more in mental health, substance abuse, to help people before they find themselves in situations where they need to call 911. And we also need to improve training for police on things like de-escalation. We need to improve transparency. We need to improve accountability. And we need to do a lot of what we've set out in the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Thank you for the question. Here's one for you, Doctor, from Emily in Rancho Santa Margarita. Even though the rate of infection is climbing again, it appears that the death rate is lower than it was back in April and May. Why is that? Thank you for having these town halls.
Well, Emily, thanks for your question. And I'm honored to be on this platform to share information to help the community to understand and respond effectively to the epidemic. So this is a question that a lot of people have been asking me lately. The case fatality rate is calculated by taking the number of people who died from a disease and dividing that by the number of people who have the disease. And we call the number on top the numerator and the number on the bottom the denominator on that fraction. And this figure can be affected by lots of things, such as the precision that we use to classify someone as a case and the likelihood that people that are being tested are actually infected. So in the beginning of this pandemic, when the test kits were scarce, we were primarily only testing people who have symptoms, and a few high-risk groups that needed to be tested, such as healthcare workers. So as a result, the denominator was weighted towards the sickest cases. So the proportion of deaths among people who tested positive was really high. It was about 2.5% of all the people who were tested positive and found to be infected were dying of the disease. However, since then, we've discovered that many people have asymptomatic or mild infection, and by adding those to the denominator, by doing more testing of people who are asymptomatic and people who are contacts who might not be sick yet, we've increased that number on the bottom of that fraction. And so it looks like the case fatality rate is going down. But I just want to point out there that we still have 124,000 people who have died in this country in the first 5 months of the epidemic in our country. And so I don't want to, just because the case fatality rate seems to be less than what we originally thought, we can't deny that this is a very serious disease. This is about 3 to 4 times the number of cases of deaths due to influenza in an entire year. So the other thing I want to point out is that this is another statistic I want to throw out, is that we've been starting to do more testing with antibodies in the general population to see what percentage have ever been infected in the past. And we're finding that usually it's around 3 to 5%. New York, after their spike, some studies showed about 20% of the population had been infected. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, 10% of the US population has been infected so far. What that means is that the number of cases, the number of deaths could increase by 90%, meaning that we could expect many, many more cases to occur if everybody gets infected. So I think what we need to do is realize that this is still a very serious disease, even if the case fatality rate is not as high as what it was when we initially started investigating the epidemic, and continue to do our part to try to keep that number down.
Thank you for that, Doctor. Kate on Facebook says, in a town hall a few weeks ago, you mentioned disability protection for those at risk who may be reluctant to return to work soon. Can you expand on this, please? I sure can. As I said a few weeks ago, and thank you for watching again, some of my colleagues are thinking of ways to expand disability insurance eligibility for those who don't feel healthy enough to go back to work, and I absolutely think we should address that. Another thing that you should know, the HEROES Act, which again we passed over a month ago, does include provisions to help for those who've been on the job for at least 30 calendar days to take up to 12 weeks of job-protected paid leave under FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, regardless of the size of their employers. And employees can take this leave for a number of reasons, and one is if it's needed in order to comply with a recommendation or in order to self-isolate because physical presence at work would jeopardize the health of the employee or other employees or a person in the employee's household. You can also apply for the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation, which is the 13-week benefit for people who have been, already used all their unemployment, their regular unemployment insurance, or whose benefit year on their regular UI claim has expired. But you pay into these programs so that they're there when you need them, so that you can cover your rent, pay for your expenses, and I encourage you to apply. And if you need any help in applying, contact our office, please. And look, my focus continues to be on trying to respond to the needs as they actually are in the community, not putting our head in the sand, declaring mission accomplished, and saying we just need to take a pause and let things work out. We've got to be proactive, and we've got to meet people where they're at to try to prevent the loss of further lives and further livelihoods. Ashton and Vista says, I'm concerned that the Republicans are trying to sneak in abortion restrictions in some of these bills that are for the purpose of assisting small businesses and providing health care. I've heard them make the argument that abortion is not essential health care. How can we stop this from happening in the next Senate bill? Well, I can tell you that Democrats in Congress are very vigilant of things like this. We're not going to allow a bill to pass the House if it includes these more draconian provisions, and I will always support a woman's constitutional right to make her own reproductive health decisions. And so between the congressional leadership, members like myself, and all of our staff, just know that there are a lot of us monitoring every single line of every single bill, and we're going to try to avoid any kind of situation like the one that you described. Here's a question from Ryan in Rancho Santa Fe. What can Congress do to increase testing and contact tracing? Well, we can pass the HEROES Act. Very simple. It can contain significant additional funds, including funds to go to state and local government. We've done this before in the CARES Act. We need to do a lot more of it. And again, it's clear the administration is not going to do adequate testing, adequate contact tracing alone. And we've also seen that Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans are not willing to fight for this either. We had to fight tooth and nail when we passed the additional funding in mid-April to have more funds for the Paycheck Protection Program. We had to fight tooth and nail to also include $100 billion, of which $25 billion would go to testing and tracing. $11 billion of that was supposed to go to the states. But I have to tell you, I was outraged when I read recently that $14 billion of that money has not gotten to our frontline medical professionals to do that testing. Absolutely unconscionable to me. And we're going to continue to fight to ensure that that money that we've already passed on a bipartisan basis gets to where it needs to go. And moreover, on May 24th, the administration provided the Congress with what was supposed to be a national testing strategy. It was required by the legislation we passed. And it was, in the nicest word I can use, it was a joke. It was a joke. It was not a national testing strategy. It really had a twofold purpose. One was to pat themselves on the back for things that they'd already done. But that was, again, not a national testing strategy. The other was to punt on major decisions to the states. And as Andrew Cuomo said very well, if you're going to pass the buck, you better pass the bucks. And so that's all we're asking for the administration to do. Here's a question for Dr. Garfein from Stephen in Del Mar. Does the humidity level have any effect on the transmission of COVID-19? Boy, I hope not, because DC right now, doctor, is very humid. For instance, should we add humidifiers or dehumidifiers to our workspace?
Yeah, Stephen, that's a good question. I'm afraid I don't have a solid answer for you, but I can give you a little bit of information that might help you decide. There's a study that was just published in Frontiers in Public Health last month that suggests that at high humidity, such as humidity greater than 70%, viruses survive under moist conditions in the droplets under the normal physiologic conditions that they would find in the body. But at moderate humidity, at say 40 to 60%, the salts within those droplets get concentrated, and that can actually deactivate the virus. And then at very low humidity, such as less than 30%, those salts crystallize out of the solution, which might then keep the virus active. So there's sort of there's a point where when it's really humid, it can make the virus less likely to survive in the environment. When it's sort of in a middle zone, it can make it, sorry, let me back up. If it's very humid, the virus can survive in droplets longer periods of time because they don't dry out. If it's very, very dry, the virus can also survive in these droplets that are very light and can float through the air and farther distances. And when you get to sort of that comfort zone in the middle, that's where the virus is actually less likely to survive based on this study. There's also evidence that places that are very moist but not too hot, such as tropical regions during the rainy season, the virus can actually survive longer as large aerosol particles and circulate through the air. So it's one other article that I found that was interesting showed that at relative humidity between 20 and 50%, the actual ciliary action in the nose and throat and lungs that clears the body of particles like viruses can't work as well. And so in other words, in arid conditions, the virus might not only increase the persistence of the virus, but it also might compromise somebody's host immunity. So there is probably some benefit in humidifying your air. If you're in a really dry place like Arizona, it might be good to provide some humidity. But you don't want to overdo it and make your room like a sauna, because that can actually help the virus to survive longer.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that. Monica in La Jolla says, I saw that you were in DC this week. Actually, Monica, I'm still here. What precautions do you take when you're traveling? Well, it's an excellent question, Monica. I obviously follow all those guidelines from the CDC. I wear a mask always. I socially distance and obviously avoid any unnecessary gatherings. We are taking a lot of precautions in the House. The way that we're voting is fundamentally different. Members of the House usually spend a lot of time congregating and negotiating, and a lot of that, unfortunately, is not happening the way that it used to. It's a necessary thing, obviously, given the pandemic. But the other thing I'll mention is I'm trying to minimize the number of times I fly back and forth. Normally, I would, during a typical voting week, I would leave California on a Monday or a Tuesday and stay a few days here and then fly back on a Thursday or a Friday. So for the 2 weeks in June and the 2 weeks in July that we are here, I'll be staying the weekend. First time I've ever had to do that as a member of Congress. The other thing I'll mention, which I think is actually very good news, is that Washington, D.C. lifted their stay-at-home order on Friday, May 29th. So we do see that things have gotten better here in D.C. The last time I was here, the stay-at-home order was still in place. And my great hope is that we'll continue to see things stay under control, that we'll continue to see many of my colleagues adhere to those rules. I am concerned that a number of my colleagues are not wearing masks, also walking outside to and from votes from my office to voting rather than inside through the tunnels, particularly not the greatest when it's humid and very hot, which it is here, but certainly better than being inside those tunnels with members that are not wearing masks, not socially distancing. And I just don't understand when this became political. Follow the rules. And there's just a handful of members that are not doing that. And it's really just very unfortunate that they have to continuously be called out just to follow the rules of their own federal government. But it is what it is. Here's a question for you, Doctor, from Heather. In Lake Forest. Heather asks, if another country, such as the United Kingdom, approves a coronavirus vaccine before the U.S., would you feel comfortable taking it?
The short answer there is sure. Why not? The UK, the EU, other countries, they have agencies like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration that investigate that look at the data from the trials that are done on the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And if the data show from these trials that the vaccine is safe and effective and that they're manufactured using good manufacturing practices, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't. Most of the trials that we do for drugs and vaccines are not just done in the United States. They're actually done using sites around the world so that we actually get good data on how well these vaccines work in multiple different populations under multiple settings. So if those trials come out and show that the vaccine is effective and they're manufactured in another country, but the data is there to say that they're safe and they work, I have no objection to taking them.
Thank you for that. Chelsea in San Juan Capistrano asks, what has Congress done to help students who are struggling to pay for tuition and housing during COVID-19? Are there any plans to support students in the fall when we go back to college if there's a second wave? Yes, Chelsea, we've tried to support our students. The CARES Act actually contained a lot of funds for higher education. Not enough, but a significant amount of funds, $31 billion for both K through 12 and for higher ed. And at least half of those funds that schools receive have to go to those students to help them with housing, food, other essentials. And in our district, I was very pleased to report that UCSD got $35 million, roughly $35 million. Maricosta College got a little over $5.5 million, and Saddleback received around $4.3 million. So that funding means that a lot of students are going to be able to get or will get in the future cash that they can spend for housing, for food, and for other necessities. Of course, the HEROES Act goes further. I think we need to acknowledge and listen to our local education leaders. They are really going to need more help. Now, the recent California budget avoided some of the more draconian cuts to K through 12, but will make significant cuts to higher ed. So we've just got to be mindful of that, and the federal government needs to help. That's why we need that money to go to state and local governments, particularly in a state like California, where we went from a $21 billion surplus to a $54 billion deficit overnight. Again, the pandemic has not taken a pause, and neither can we. So that's the end of our questions, or at least the end of the time we have for questions right now. I know both of you have openings or have closing statements. You both have done an amazing job. I want to turn it to you, Dante, for your closing thoughts, and thank you again for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Mike, again for letting me use your platform to express my opinion. And again, for the younger generation, if you're out there listening, don't be scared to put yourself out there. Let it be known that your voice is just as important as your father's voice, your mother's voice, your grandmother's voice, your grandfather's voice. And for the older generation, let the younger generation know that you're here. Keep the conversations going. Allow them access to your network. Help bring them to the table. You know, instead of meeting with a council member, and bring your grandchildren. Bring them to the table. Let them see that respect can be given equally, no matter the age, by one of your community leaders. And again, Mom, I wanted to say hi, Mom, real quick, and hi, Dad. Yeah, I know they're tuned in watching this, so again, thank you, Mike.
Well, Dante, they've got to be very proud of you, as we all are, and I am so hopeful. When I went out to the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests, seeing young people from all backgrounds, all walks of life, all parts of our district come together, and it really is that next generation that I think gives me hope. And, you know, I'm a card-carrying optimist, and I know that the big issues of our day, young people are really leading the way, whether it be racial injustice, social injustice, environmental injustice, economic injustice, gun violence prevention, climate change, you name it. I'm just so thrilled to see all the activism, and obviously support our younger generation getting civically engaged, because ultimately I'm most concerned when they talk about swing voters. I'm concerned about those who may or may not show up and vote at all. And I think you need to understand that your vote counts, and also not just voting for people at the top of the ticket, but all the way down. If you had any question, hopefully the last few months clear up the importance of who you elect, whether it be your county sheriff, your county supervisor, your city council member. These positions matter. Your school board members, et cetera, et cetera. And the crisis that we're going through now in this country, I think, really illuminates that. Dr. Garfein, what a week in COVID-19. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank you for attending your 12th town hall. And I'd love to get your closing thoughts this week.
Well, thanks, Mike. First, I just want to echo your thoughts to Dante. You know, I think I really appreciate you putting yourself out there and taking a risk to speak out in public, because I think it's just so important right now. My two children are probably about your age, and it's an exciting time. I mean, I think our generation is really looking to your generation to take the reins and show us what you can do. And so, you know, you're encouraging your peers to get out there and do the same is fantastic. So keep at it, and thanks for your efforts. So just in closing, I read a great article this week in the Atlantic by Julia Marcus. She's an epidemiologist and professor at the Harvard Medical School. And she talks about how Americans are beat down and run down after months of loss of income and social isolation. And I definitely can relate to that. And what she says is, masks don't deprive people of oxygen, but they do make it harder to breathe freely. They fog up people's glasses. They make noses itch and faces sweat. Many masks feel decidedly uncool. They are yet another thing to remember when walking out of our front door. And most of all, masks are a constant reminder of what Americans are so desperately wanting to forget, and that despite all of our sacrifices, the pandemic hasn't gone anywhere yet. And I think that's just so poignant because it is what we're all experiencing. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that and for us to talk to each other about that and talk about how we're feeling rather than just sort of make a political football out of the issue of wearing masks and, accusing mask wearers of being on one party and non-mask wearers of being in another party. I think we really need to sort of remind ourselves about why we're doing it and acknowledge the fact that it's not fun, it's not comfortable, it makes us feel like we're not engaging the way we used to. But I think right now it's essential. And so on that, I just kind of like to put out an example of my own mother. She's 86 years old, and she needed to go to the pharmacy. If she walks in there and she sees people without masks on, she's basically feeling like she's walking into a war zone. Every person in that store that doesn't have a mask on is a potential threat to her life. And so I think if you put that into context, if we think about, the people that we care about in our community, the fact that we're not wearing masks is actually a threat to all those people. And I think if we can sort of remember that, it'll help us to sort of remember why we're doing this in the first place and why it's important. So it's not a matter of giving up personal freedoms or trying to be macho and saying, I don't need a mask because I'm strong enough, I can fight off the virus if I get infected, or I'm young enough and it's not going to affect me. We're really doing this to protect our community, and we're all in it together, and we really have to work together to do this. And so, that's my pitch, and I'm sticking with it. Use masks, social distance, use good practices in public and at home, and let's work to get through this. And on that, I'd just like to thank Robert Wood again for helping me to prepare the responses to these questions, and also to apologize to any listeners who have emailed me and I haven't had a chance to get back to them yet. I do try to answer all questions in my spare time, but the questions are good and I appreciate it.
Well, we thank you so much. And the Dr. Garfein fan club is alive and well, and it's great to see you. And obviously, thank you for all of your great answers and input. We are actually going to be doing something for the first time since the middle of March, which is we are going to take a 1-week break from these town halls. We'll be back on July the 8th and July the 11th. And that will be our 29th and 30th town halls. But in the interim, we're going to have Independence Day. We're very excited about that. I hope everybody has as great a 4th of July as you can under these crazy circumstances. We're going to be definitely experiencing the 4th of July in a different way, but nonetheless, I hope that you spend that time with your loved ones and that your loved ones are all healthy and all safe. Just to echo what the doctor said, I think it's so critically important more than ever that we follow those guidelines and those recommendations. It should not be a political event to wear a mask or not wear a mask. It's merely about trying to protect others and trying to show basic respect and use common sense. We're still in the middle of a highly infectious pandemic, and we've got to act like it, and we've got to be smart. We all want the same thing, to reopen the economy, to get back to normal. The more that we follow the guidelines with masks and social distancing and all the rest, the quicker we'll be able to get back to normal. And I just hope that y'all take heed that the virus doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or a libertarian or a vegetarian or anything else. The virus is going to do what the virus is going to do. And we all have to just be realistic about that. And do the best we can. And, finally, once again, I want to express the importance of confronting the racial inequality and systematic injustice in our country. I think the bill that we passed this week in Congress was a very positive step in the right direction. But the only way I see us getting through this difficult time, as I've said before, is if we all, as best we can, try to listen to one another, try to help one another, and particularly try to advocate for those who need our help the most. And that's how we're going to bring about real change. So I want to thank you both. Again, thank you, Dante. Thank you, Dr. Garfein. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care.